Was the IS-2 a waste of resources? After all, the KV series did pretty well and could have been upgraded. To answer this question, we asked Peter Tankerhive Samsonov, who looked into Soviet sources of the time. He published a book with us about the IS-2, which you can get at the following link or on Amazon. One question that came up, is the IS-2 a waste of resources? Because it seems like a lot of resources went into it, and I mean, some people might argue the KV-1 was a pretty good heavy tank, created a lot of troubles for the Germans, and the T-34 also performed well. So was it necessary, or?
In the alternate history circles, there are a few people that do like the KV-1, KV-1S, KV-85 family, and they do say, oh, they could have modernized it forever. Just keep going with that. And there's also a group of people who like the T-28, and they say, oh, the T-28 could have been modernized to replace the KV or replace the T-34. So fans of these tanks do exist, and Soviet engineers at 1943, 1944, there were quite a few of these fans among them. And so there was a lot of effort actually to keep the KV on the assembly line, even while the IS-2 was being not just developed, but even produced. But before we get there, let's go back to the beginning of the Soviet heavy tank program. I'm going to dismiss the T-35 because it was a little bit of a protracted prototype as opposed to a real mass-produced heavy tank. But 1939, we're building the KV-1. The KV-1 U-0 pilot tank is designed to weigh 40 tons, which, for 1930s, very much a heavy tank. They finished building it. The tank that's sent to Finland to fight in the Winter War weighs 42 tons. Okay, that's, it's not a huge weight increase. There's always kind of a small bump between theory and practice. Why not? The U-7 pilot tank, which was the prototype for the production series, already weighed 44 tons. So by the time we entered production, we had already surpassed our weight limit by 10%. And that, okay, fine, 10%, that's not so bad. That's within tolerances. But the Army's appetites always grow, right? There's always changes, there's always improvements, there's always simplifications you can make, and all of those have a cost. And the cost is more often than not is weight. By January 1941, the F-32 gun goes into production. The F-32 has the same ballistics as the L-11, but it's easier to produce. These tanks, the KV-1 tanks equipped with the F-32 gun, already weigh 46 tons, more than 46 tons. And then, of course, Soviet intelligence finds out about German super heavy tank programs. The information's a little bit vague, but it's probably like the VK-65, and I think they found out about the VK-3601 as well. And of course, they got scared of these phantom tanks and said, okay, we need to build our own super heavy tanks, KV-3, KV-4, KV-5, but for now, what we need to do is up-armor our existing tanks. So KV-1 got a full set of applique armor. That increased it to 49 tons. You might know it as the KV-1E, even though that index, I've never seen it in Soviet period documents. 49 tons, summer of 1941. Very quickly, the Red Army figures out this is kind of excessive, and also we're not really seeing any of these German super heavy tanks, so maybe dial it down a little bit. But at the same time, welded turrets are transitioning to cast turrets because cast turrets are easier to produce. Again, there's simplifications made to the design because wartime economy, you need to build more tanks faster, which means you have to simplify, which means you have to, your nice clean bends and curves that you could do before, that's no longer an option, which means the weight keeps climbing and climbing and climbing. And so and of course, new gun. The F-32 is replaced with the ZIS-5, same caliber, longer barrel, thicker gun mantlet, more weight, more weight, more weight. And so by the end of 1942, you end up with a 50-ton tank on a 40-ton tank chassis, which, as we all know from our studies of the Panther, is a very bad idea. This kicked off a whole lot of weight reduction measures, especially since mobility issues really came up in the winter of 1941-42. Stalin was personally involved because this was a looming disaster. How could our heavy tank just kind of fall apart as it drives around? That's not acceptable. There were some different measures, different programs, but eventually it all culminated into introduction of the KV-1S. So radical measures were taken to reduce the weight to 42.5 tons, measures that include thinning out the armor, which was a pretty radical move because the army always wants more armor, and you're giving them a tank with less armor, considerably less armor. So the KV-1 could not be modernized forever, essentially. It couldn't even be modernized to tackle the threats that it saw in 1942, because, the Germans pushed out the 75mm POC 40. You would want a tank with more armor to resist that as opposed to less, but, got to work with what you have. Let's rewind back to 1941 for a second. So the KV-1 was no longer satisfactory even before the appearance of these German super heavy tanks. So the KV-1 was a whole family of tanks was developed to replace it. If you played the World of Tanks, you've probably seen the T-150. An improved version of that called T-222. That was the tank that originally received the index KV-3. So this KV-3 would have weighed around 50 tons. The T-50 actually ended up weighing around 50 tons, and they had a ton of issues with it. Torsion bars breaking, the engine was malfunctioning, the cooling system was overheating. The T-222 was never finished, so I'm not sure if any of these problems would have been resolved on that tank. But the T-150 had tons of problems. So it might not have gone into production even if the KV-3 was not then replaced with the T-223 or the KV-3 that if you play World of Tanks or make models or something. So that leads me to believe that with early 40s Soviet technology, 50 tons was the limit. You could not make a functional heavy tank that weighed more than 50 tons. That would not be reliable enough to be used in combat. Now let's go back to 1943. Why build the IS-1 when you have the KV-85? Super easy, right? Just put a new turret on your current tank. Presto, done. All right, you don't need the IS-2. You have the KV-122. Same thing, new turret, existing tank. Bob's your uncle, right? Super easy to put into production. Why even bother with this new tank design? The problem was that it was not actually super easy to put into production. There was a ton of production. There was a ton of teething troubles with the KV-85. Not even all of them had to do with the turret. A lot of them had to do with the fact, and tell me if this sounds familiar, this tank that used to weigh 42 tons now weighs 46 tons because you put a bigger turret on it. And now it suffers from mechanical issues. And you have to reinforce things, you have to polish things, you have to improve things, which again brings more weight with it. And so your tank that used to weigh 42 tons, you put a better gun on it, now it weighs 47 tons. Sound familiar? Right. They were heading for exactly the same problem that they hit in the fall of 1941, in the winter of 1941-42. Except, and even on almost the same tank chassis. And yeah, the armor of the KV-1S was cut very intentionally to save on weight, and it was considered inadequate, especially for a heavy tank, especially for a heavy breakthrough tank. And so naturally, there was a proposal to increase the armor of the KV-122 to make it competitive. It would have been 90 millimeters all around, so comparable with what the IS-2 had. Plus minus slopes, comparable with what the IS-2 had, let's say, in 1944. But the trick is, with that proposal, the difference between the KV-85 and the KV-122 was 60 kilograms. And you can't increase the armor of a tank from 75 to 90 millimeters, or on the sides from 60 to 90 millimeters, and only spend 60 kilograms. And so if you just take the weight difference between the IS-1 and the IS-2 and apply it to the KV-85, you're going to end up with, a 50-ton heavy tank. A 50-ton heavy tank that can trace its heritage all the way back to the KV-1 from 1939. And now you're stuck with the same problem that you were stuck in the winter of 41-42. So rewinding 2 years of technical progress right back where you started. So as you can see, you can't really, you can move the slider back and forth. You're just going to arrive at the same place you were before, unless you do something radically different. And the KV-13 tank introduced in the summer of 1942 was something radically different. The shape of the hull was changed dramatically. So the KV-13 was a 30-ton heavy tank. That was the objective, is you take a tank with the weight of a T-34 and you give it enough armor to shrug off a hit from an 88mm gun. And, that sounds impossible, and turns out you can do that. You just have to sacrifice an awful lot. But by the summer of 1943, in addition to this lumbering, KV-1S that's no longer so speedy, and it's now quite slow and reaching, the weight of its ancestors, you have this tank, the IS-1, IS-85, that's much better protected, much better laid out. It has the same gun, it has the same turret, but it weighs considerably less. And so even with a smaller engine, because the IS series had a top horsepower of 520 HP, whereas the KV-1 had 600, even with that lower horsepower, it had much better mobility because of the weight difference and because of the better transmission gearbox technology.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.